Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Here we are for our second podcast on the course material for our second week. I'm Dr. Rob Byer, and with me is my companion,
Professor Dan McClure.
And we're going to be talking about the West and a little bit of ethical theory and some history today. So, as it was last time, our structure will be: we will start with the history. Dr. McClure will talk about the history both contained in the Richardson text and drawing on his additional expertise. Then we'll move to discussing ethical theory. For this week, it's consequentialism, and particularly utilitarianism and virtue theory. And then we will go on to talk a little bit about the game and some of the essays in our companion text, Red Dead Redemption: History, Myth, and Violence in the Video Game West. So, Dan, do you want to get us started off today?
Yeah, so these readings, chapters 4 through 7, are really looking at the 1870s and 1880s, going into the early 1890s. This post-Civil War moment, often called Reconstruction, but it's also the historical moment of, quote, the Old West, the 1860s, 70s, 80s, become that quintessential setting for Western films. And it's obviously the setting for Red Dead Redemption, though Red Dead Redemption takes place in, 2 at least, takes place in 1899 at the end of this time period. But it's interesting to work through the politics unfolding after the Civil War.
That's kind of where we left off last time.
Yeah, because it's sort of, by the time you get into the early 70s, you have both the, quote, new departure Democrats who distance themselves from the older Southern Democrats, but you also have disgruntled Republicans who are trying to separate themselves from the more radical Republicans, but also the, I guess you could say, the Republicans that were very much in favor of a pro-industry, tariffs, government intervention on behalf of business.
Yeah. But
that also had government intervention in the South to protect the rights of freedmen. Mm-hmm. And in a way, Richardson kind of sets this up as a new or a reformed vision of an American norm, like a political norm. Mm-hmm. And what comes out of this is the liberal Republican Party, right, which sought to reverse government growth after the Civil War. And in a way, it's a middle view, a compromise between the original Northern free labor vision and the Southern ideas of proper government, like what can government do, what should government not do.
Yeah.
The platform was for a small government, but also the idea that you don't have government involved in society in the way that was happening with Reconstruction or the corruption that was surrounding, giving land to railroads and all that kind of, all that.
The grift.
Yeah. And so the idea is if you have a smaller government, there's going to be less corruption. The other part of this too is this idea that you're fighting against special interests. In this sense, right? You want a small government. You don't want a federal government that is under the influence of special interests. And in this sense, what this middle view is trying to target is basically workers and African Americans who are demanding government support, but also the railroads and other corporations who often are going against individual settlers, right? So there is this replay of older ideas, but now we're in a different time period, and especially, we'll get to this point, but the evolution of the corporation during this time is significant, and it helps to set the tone for what happens in the 20th century.
Yeah.
The key to this, and this is on 125 Richardson, where she writes, inherent in their opposition to special interests was a refusal to accept the idea that systematic racial, economic, gender, or social inequalities made it harder for some Americans to climb the economic ladder. Anyone who complained of such systematic discrimination, they implied, was not, as they put it, a patriotic citizen, right?
Yeah.
So this idea that there is racial or gender inequalities or economic inequalities, those are sort of illusions. You just need to work hard, right? The bootstraps idea. To not do that is to not be a patriotic citizen.
Yeah.
And we can kind of see how that that strain of thought continues
Absolutely.
through the present. And there's a reason for it, right? There's this idealization that if you just work hard, you'll get the benefits from the hard work you put into it.
Yeah.
Things are changing, though. I think Montgomery Ward went out of business a few years ago, maybe a decade or so. But the rise of Aaron Montgomery Ward's business, right, which becomes Montgomery Ward's, the idea that you're selling directly to farmers without middlemen is a new idea. He's the original Costco, maybe we could put it that way. The West, especially after the war's finished, there's so many tropes in like Civil War, post-Civil War movies where as soon as the war is over, we're heading west.
That's right.
Right, and so the West becomes this beacon of a place to go. Obviously, if you're, hopefully by week 2, you should be pretty far along. But early on, there's this discussion with the gang. Why aren't we heading west still? Why are we going back east?
That's right, yeah.
And, it falls into this idea that our freedom lies in the West.
Yeah. That's the only place left for us to buy some land, to live as we see fit, outside the bounds of civilization in this authentic, right, kind of rugged way of life or something like that.
Yeah.
The West is multiple times described as the Virgin West or as virginal or something.
Yeah, yeah. And in that, right, we'll get to this, but, the idea of Native Americans too, like... Native Americans are swept. This is the moment that there's the major Indian Wars, the last phase, you could say, of the quote Indian Wars that play out. But this time it's through sort of an industrial technology. I mean, if we were to globalize this, the moment of imperialism is really the moment that industrial capitalism, industrial grade weapons enter places like East Asia, Africa, and overwhelm groups that
the indigenous peoples currently live in.
Yeah, like you might have been able to replicate muskets, but there's no way you can replicate the steel work of industrial grade weapons.
Yeah.
Important in this too is the painting by John Gast from 1872, American Progress.
Yeah.
Where it
it's a
shows
pretty stunning
this
image.
Yeah, it's to me, when you look at the game and the map of the game is definitely encompassing so much of that Midwest up through the Rockies.
Yeah.
But the painting of the American Progress gives this almost a version of the game in that, where you have obviously in the east you have these cities, lights coming from the east heading west, right? The light of civilization. I want to say this angelic woman, she's putting telegraph lines.
Yeah.
And there's a railroad, and then there's these settlers moving. But off into the eastern part you have animals, and then also Native Americans, right? Kind of lumped in with the animals that are scurrying off picture.
Yes.
And again, this, it's sort of, I mean, when you're teaching this, it's the quintessential sort of image to have students look at.
Yeah.
And to, get into this mindset, because it's not, again, it's American progress, not the tragedy of what's happening with westward expansion. Right?
Yeah.
We have to look at it through this.
It's manifest destiny, but almost used in an unironic way. Or
Yes,
like
yeah. 1872 is also the first election where black voters participate. It's also, again, this early 70s is the moment the big business is beginning to be seen in a negative light. when we think of the rise of big business, the origin is arguably in that Civil War period where there's war contracts and that kind of that's a good way to accumulate capital that you can then invest later on through sort of guaranteed contracts. But big business really explodes the moment that the railroad comes in, because you have steel production for trains for the rail itself.
Yeah.
The railroad brings Eastern access to Western resources. It begins to pull the nation together economically. The other part, and really the quintessential corporation in this is the railroad itself.
Yeah.
Right. Which, a railroad just isn't just one building. It has sort of a geographic scope.
Yeah.
The railroads had to come up with management systems. You can't have railroads without the telegraph, right? So the telegraph is key to running a successful railroad. All these sorts of things, right, make this post-war big business different than, say, the before. It's greater in scope, right? One of the ways you could think of like capitalism in general, right? The way capitalism is different, say, than economic exchange before, the 1500s. Capitalism as sort of this, different system of market relations is born in a transoceanic network world.
Okay.
Versus, say, all the trade, the trade that moves from China to South Asia to India,
along the Silk Road, or
to
something.
Persia, or across the Silk, where it passes through 6, 7, 8 hands before it gets to the end.
Yeah.
Where capitalism is born in the moment where you have a ship or a group of ships go to a location, bring the resources back, and it's one shot, right? It becomes different. It's also more expensive. It's sort of I always think of space travel like the moment that you send something, an expedition to the belt to mine, that is going to take so much money. Yeah. Not one business is going to be able to do it alone.
Yeah.
The amount of capital will be obscene.
Yeah.
Right, but once that gets put into play, we'll have a different economic arrangement out of that. Who knows what that would be?
Sure.
But the same way this happens with, the moment that Europeans help pioneer this, this transoceanic trade. The railroad across North America embodies that. Yeah. It just changes. It changes the shape of economic relations.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that I think is kind of interesting about this is it allows, but also kind of requires there to be, various dispersed like settlements or groups of people, because you need labor at all of those points, as well as an endpoint for the commerce to go to or whatever. And even that is something that I still think about today. I talked with a guy who works for one of the railroads up in Alliance, Nebraska, and he described it as like there are these towns that are basically just railroad towns, these tiny little towns out in Nebraska that the only real employer or driver is working on the railroad, and you get paid pretty well, and so people are willing to live in these really small kind of rural areas partly for that. So I just think that's kind of an interesting additional thing to
where it continues, right?
Yeah.
The other thing too that is the pioneering change is the way that corporations are legally manifested, right? Before as Richardson writes, before the mid 19th century, a company interested in incorporating had to prove to a state legislature that it was performing a function that directly promoted the public good, right? So the Erie Canal. You're going to incorporate to make the Erie Canal, and then at the end of the project, it dissolves. Yeah. And then everyone gets paid out. During the Civil War, this definition shifts. A corporation still had to perform a public function, but was no longer bound by the moral imperatives imposed on earlier corporations.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a way, it becomes you could say deregulated.
Yeah, divorced from some kind of like moral or communal component or something.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens too is that 14th Amendment, right? The rights of citizenship. Obviously, that's it was put in 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment were put in for for freedmen, the end of slavery. But in terms of court cases, the vast majority, I think only 19 out of 300 something, went to cases with African Americans. The vast majority basically had corporations, going into court saying that they're people, and they used the 14th Amendment to make that argument. And so
that's interesting.
And in a way that allows the corporation to become,
to take on the role of a person.
It can't die.
Oh,
right?
sure.
There's an eternal component to it. And so, and that again, that's, I think people forget that's a change. From before, you had a more regulated existence. The corporation afterwards, after the Civil War, becomes this thing that we're more familiar with, right?
Sure.
I'd say there's a reason why
it outlives its directors, it outlives its shareholders, it outlives all of those things.
Yeah, there's a reason why when you go through this history, it sounds strange.
Sure.
Because
it's foreign to how we normally think about it or what our experience is like.
The other part, too, is finance capitalism that takes off.
Explain a little more about that.
So finance capitalism, right, you had businesses that were incorporating, and now you have people selling stock, right, raising money on the open market.
Okay.
Again, if you're especially with the railroads, you need a lot of capital up front. And so you're searching for people that want to invest.
Yeah, they want to put the money up front, but maybe don't want to be directly involved or don't want to be doing the dirty work or whatever.
Yeah, and again, that changes sort of, it changes the scale of markets. Sure. It changes the scale of investment. Again, versus, I want to open a store. Can I get some loans to get the store together? And that's really all I'm trying to do. And then, the rise of the New York Stock Exchange obviously is key in this. But again, by early 1870s, post-war businessmen are really going through a tough time. Again, and this is where that liberal Republican Party comes in. There's this imagined ideal of small producers, right? So, today you'd say the small business person, right?
Sure.
And at this time, it's the politics still can kind of go after big business as a threat to these small producers, right? That can infringe on a small producer's livelihood because of their sheer size. And as we'll see, their connections with government.
Yeah.
Right. The railroad is really, again, the railroad's really just the poster child of all of this that unfolds. Eventually, it's the steel businesses. The other part of this, too, and this is, the liberal Republican Party, to attack the Republican Party, they start, and what Richardson says, they kind of come up with this trope that African Americans were being the Republican Party were favoring African Americans and favoring big business, right? And so if people were thinking that big business was corrupt, African Americans are lumped into that category too. And this is that backlash, right, against sort of emancipation, but the idea that now that African Americans are not enslaved, there's they're equal, and there's no reason why government should be intervening.
Yeah. So one way to think about this is the objection from the point of view of this kind of small producer would be, well, the government is giving these advantages that are unfair to these big corporations and big groups, and so similarly, right, a person might interpret, well, these people have been freed, right? They're no longer people who were enslaved, and so now they have the same abilities that I do and stuff, so why are they getting unfair extra treatment or something like that? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, and it's easier to go, it's a closer target.
Sure,
right?
Absolutely,
there's always a reason why you want to, try to punch, as they say, punch down instead of punching up.
Yeah.
This is the same moment, right? 1873, Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner write The Gilded Age. Right, so this is very much just in the atmosphere of literature, sort of common sense. This is also the moment of John Muir, right, and thinking about the West in terms of saving the environment.
Conservation.
Yeah, conservation. I do think, when you're playing Red Dead Redemption 2, those moments where you're not focused, and maybe it's going to be harder for the 4-week class, but if you play it again after the class, the moments where, you're just kind of, you don't have to do the missions and you're just riding around. And there is this, I think part of the draw to the game is how incredible it looks.
Absolutely. It's cinematic.
Yeah, and you can go fishing. Hopefully you're not attacked by an animal. But there's, but it's, when the first time I played it, that's what I kept thinking about was sort of this John Muir and those old the turn of the century photographs. I can't remember the name. A lot of it was from California.
Okay.
I'd have to look up the famous photographer, but it kind of just goes together. This pristine West. Yeah. That I definitely think that the game developers had, obviously we're playing with in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, even, we'll get to it later, but even that first essay in our section for today talked about that. And one thing that I really enjoyed about that was just, and I mean, it was something that I also noticed about the game, but, didn't think about it or would put it as formally, I guess, was the game is really not, it's really trying to make you engage with the territory. You're supposed to be traveling by horse. There are not a ton of options to do fast travel. And in fact, even those, you're kind of discouraged actively, mechanically in the game from doing that. And because it just takes so long to get anywhere via horse, right? You just have to be in the area, right? Even the way the mini-map is set up is not always super helpful other than giving you a direction. You have to pay attention to the things in the game. And so it's really taking advantage of these kind of panoramic views, these beautiful landscapes to do exactly that, to get you to do that. So
yeah, there's definitely this time. There's a playing with time in the game that doesn't happen in a lot of other games that you can fast travel everywhere.
Yes,
and you can fast travel in this, but even the fast travel is, you have to watch something. Yeah. It's a slow load.
That's right, yeah. And it's not to anywhere you want to be, it's to a few select locations.
That's true, yeah. Ansel Adams is the photographer.
Okay.
So but this idea of this kind of pristine, very crystal clear...
nature, untouched by civilization, unmarred by the hand of man, all of that kind of stuff.
And this kind of plays into this ideal versus real, right? Idea, if this sort of emerging middle class ideal, small producer, federal government shouldn't help big business, federal government shouldn't help African Americans or workers. Yeah. You're right, everyone should just be, working on their own. This ideal is translated also into sort of images of the West at the same time. And I think the paradox of the game, and we'll get into this with, the chapters from Wills and Wright, but the idea of the West itself arises, arguably when, one of the main people is William F. Cody or Buffalo Bill. Yeah. Who was, here at Fort Hayes, Fort Larned, right?
That's right, yep.
Just we're right in the area.
We are.
But there's even a self-consciousness at the time of them doing something. Like to me, that's fascinating because it's very, if you read stuff about, the idea of postmodernity and, the self-consciousness of, doing things, knowing you're doing things to the point where everyone's like selfies, to me, it's the ultimate self-consciousness, or doing a quick video TikTok, right? It's self-conscious being in a space and talking about that space. And it wouldn't exist. It would exist in reality, but it can't exist for everyone else unless you show it. Right? And to me, when I'm thinking of, Buffalo Bill, it's in a way he could kind of see the story. What he was doing was this story that could sell and make him money, right? So he could always be, someone who's hired to be a tracker, right, a scout. But he also realized that, I can sell these stories because I know back east they're craving.
It probably also is a lot less work.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it involves a lot less hardship and sleeping on the ground and being in actual physical danger all the time. And
Yeah. So it's, again, it's sort of like what is the authentic West when at the moment that the authentic West is being, quote, created, there's a self-consciousness there already. Yeah. And again, I think that the way that can happen is because there's a telegraph, that there's a very vibrant, network of newspapers and magazines and stories. Right? Think of all the great literature that you read in, K through 12. Most of those, if you're reading stuff before 1920, most of that stuff was like serialized,
and then by the word,
and then it was published in a book.
This is sometimes why people joke about Dickens being famously long-winded, because he was, it was all serialized. So it's like, you got to make money next week, which means, maybe we need another 1,000 words on, this person's, I don't know, Christmas goose setup or whatever, right? Because you just got to keep doing it. So,
So as Richardson keeps going with the liberal Republican platform, right? It defined a new alliance in American politics for the rest of the century. Right? This becomes the ideal that really the traditional institutional Democratic Party and the traditional institutional Republican Party. This is the tug of war. In this ideal that the liberal Republican platform kind of situates. That's the tug of war, right? The reconciliation of the North and South after the Civil War is around this idea of individualism and an idealized individualism. You get this in the game, right? With anyone you talk to about, we came out here because we wanted to be free from the city, etc. Right? Individual men could rise on their own, so long as government refused, and this is the key to this idealized individualism, so long as the government refused to pander to the interests of industrialists or disaffected workers or newly freed African Americans. Right. Critically, this new vision did not include activist women, but rather placed women firmly in the home of an individualistic man. Right. So within that, women are contained still. But they're just appendages to the individualistic man, right? Together, the men and women who embraced this worldview made up the new middle class, distinguished in this, I think this is important too to stress, distinguished not by their income, but by their determination to hold what they believed was an even-handed government, steady from the demands of those at the top as well as the bottom.
So kind of almost like less about income, more about their, I don't know, political outlook or their view on the nature of government or something.
It's a cultural identification versus like that Marxist class.
Just a socioeconomic class.
And so I thought that was really interesting. And there's that discussion too, when early in that chapter 1, when Charles is showing Arthur how to, hunt with a bow. He has that monologue about why Dutch is different.
That's right. He, that's interesting in part, I think, because one of the central, I think, I don't know, moral issues or issues of interest in the game is just, are you different, right? Is the Vanderlyn gang different than the, Lemoyne Raiders or certainly the O'Driscolls or whatever? Do you have this idea of like this, honor among thieves kind of thing, or we're outlaws but we're not criminals or something like that, which some people want to make that distinction sometimes. And the game is ambivalent about this, right? It does seem to suggest that at least at time periods, Hosea, mentions that Dutch is acting differently than he used to at different points, or maybe just in general, right? I mean, there's just this question: is Arthur, are the people that you're interacting with, are the people that you call your family and your home, right? Are they any better? Are they morally different, right, than the other kinds of outlaws and the other kind of gangs? And Charles, at least initially, says yes. And the part of the reason is because he thinks, he mentioned he's been alone, he's interacted with others. And Charles in the game, right, is half Native American and half African American, right? Or his father, he mentions, as a freedman. And so he recognizes that, generally speaking, he has not found a lot of welcome in the world. But outside of a couple instances, Micah being a good example, in the Vanderlyn gang, he is treated fairly. And that's something he identifies as different about Dutch and why he has stayed with him for so long.
Yeah.
But then as the game goes on, as all of you have seen or will see, that becomes, more
Troubled.
difficult. That's right. Yeah, problematized sometimes in the language. But.
Yeah, and Dutch has, early on when you do the train robbery, right? The Leviticus Cornwall, who is the industrialist
right?
in this, right? Who has his hands in steel and oil.
Yes, kind of Rockefeller style figure.
Yeah,
or something.
And it's it's okay if you go after him because he has extra money.
Yeah,
and you're not really hurting it. And I think that plays into the robber baron. It's okay to go rob these people. So you might be right there is a romanticism if you're not robbing small producers, but you're robbing industrialists. It's almost comical, right?
Yeah,
it's
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm just
I think there's a very similar kind of attitude that has survived to today, right? I mean, there's certainly a lot of people that are upset about department stores being broken into or having some kind of about a theft or something. But a lot of people who maybe are not so persuaded or worried about that basically just say, look, I don't know, this isn't a small mom and pop store. They're just going to write it off for insurance, or they lose this on other ways. Just right, it's like marginal in their overall figures, so like it doesn't really hurt them. It doesn't really. And they have so much, right? So it's like not a big deal or something.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Compared to that person that doesn't have the good insurance, and
a small business person who maybe can't afford it, or you've stolen this thing from them, and now basically they're gonna have to close up shop because they just can't make it anymore or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the big changes too that happens early 70s, you have the Panic of 1873, which is, I guess you could call it a depression. Some people have said that there's the original Great Depression lasts from 1873 to the early 1890s.
Okay.
But there is this economic downturn in the early 1870s. And this kind of leads us into, as we move into the 1880s, what you could say is the institutionalization of a lot of these changes, right? There's really the 1870s is this discussion on how are things going to be in this post-Civil War world, and by the 80s, a lot of the answers are in place. The panic begins through speculation, right? And this is right if on the good side with stock market, all that kind of stuff, you are able to get investment, right? It's sort of the internet, right? Like the internet allows everyone to sell things. But the internet also has more fraud, right? Like it's easier to do fraud through the stock market allows a greater reach to perhaps get investment funds to invest in something. But at the same time, speculation enters, right?
Yeah.
Arguably today with housing prices, we're in a period of speculation with sort of, what were those like, investment groups buying up houses instead of like single families buying a house, which have driven up houses. So, most likely in the next, within the next year or two, there'll be a collapse, right?
Another bubble or something.
Another bubble, and it, most likely will be the fingers will point towards speculation. Arguably that 2007-8 collapse again, speculation on housing. Most of it is housing. The internet bubble before that, and then you had in the 80s, in 87, I think the savings and loan scale. A lot of this is the speculation, land speculation. I think Florida was went into contributing to the Great Depression, and so that's a part of the bargain with industrial capitalism and the rise of finance.
Yeah. When you say speculation, can you explain that a little more? I think that would be helpful.
Speculating meaning you're betting on things to fail, or
so you're betting on things. What will happen in the future?
What will happen in the future. So you're not investing to make something.
Yeah, I'm not giving a bunch of money to produce a bunch of widgets or something.
Yeah, you're investing to like maybe corner a market.
Yeah,
and then suddenly you have everything, but all of a sudden the price just drops.
Yeah, and
then your worth plummets, but you have your hands in so many things that brings down other entities with it. It makes it an unstable sort of. That's the argument with regulations in finance, right? Like or leveraging in banks, right?
Yeah.
Like how much can banks leverage? Those are still debates that we're having today.
Sure. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. The other part too is that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is enacted to help protect the rights of African Americans in the South, especially to vote. It also creates another backlash because it's seen as a special interest, right? Like a giveaway.
This is why there's disagreements about whether or not there are natural rights to vote among people or something.
Yeah. And again, it's we're
the
haunted
Constitution
by that.
never says it, kind of thing.
Yeah, we're haunted by that 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
The Panic of 1873, in terms of even like where we're at, the Great Plains. You had the this sounds like a heavy metal band, but the Grasshopper Plague in 1874, which maybe a very gothic bluegrass band.
That's right.
Right, goes from the Dakotas to Texas and just ravages crops.
Yeah.
Farmers are, they were taking loans out from Easterners, but wholesale prices decline as well.
Yeah.
Right, and that's I think that's still a case with farmers today. How do you get stable prices? Because your investment and your cost of machinery is a certain constant rate.
Yeah.
But what you're producing can fluctuate.
Yeah, with weather.
Right. Yeah. And so
all
there's
sorts of things. Disease, blight.
Yeah. Randomness, like random environmental elements. And so this is 1870s. Farmers begin to organize. I don't really see them out here. I remember in the Pacific Northwest, I used to see these buildings, but the Grange buildings, right? Grangers.
Okay.
Right. Those were early sort of, and again, it's funny because a lot of this is taking cues from businessmen who are incorporating. And so it'd be the idea that farmers would incorporate through the Grange and you would cooperate to fix prices and limit supplies.
Okay.
Right. So you're only going to do plant so much corn. Everyone can agree upon that. And then that way you stabilize the price and everyone wins.
Yeah.
Again, we can imagine how hard that is to do when it's
Sure.
individual players and not some umbrella company that fixes the price.
I don't know enough about this, so you probably know a little more about this. Is this also related to, so out here in Kansas, in a lot of these really small towns, there are a lot of co-ops.
Yeah,
right?
that's.
So I assume this is similarly connected to this idea of the only way we're all going to be able to do this is kind of come together and talk about it and figure it out, and then pool our resources, and then this works for us, right, in this area.
I would say it's born from that.
Okay.
Like the co-ops are born from
the Grange.
This
and
moment.
From this. Okay,
yeah.
Great. It also makes me think a little bit, and you can tell me whether I'm off on this. There was that book that came out a while back called The Worst Hard Time. It's about like the Dust Bowl and kind of how some of that happened. And as I recall, it occurs in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century, talking about, kind of these like land speculators who would come in, buy a bunch of land. They would just really haphazardly, they weren't really farmers, right? They would seed a bunch of stuff, pay no attention to it, make no more care, but then they would try to get their, government coverage of it, right? And sometimes just doing that, the bet paid off and you got a lot of stuff. And then if not, you didn't really worry about it because it was like you got the land on a parcel, right? You got it for almost no money. And so this is one of the things that sounds like is related to this, that is sort of how you, in addition to the grasshopper plague, right, that led to some of the stuff in the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, I think that the federal intervention really kicks in the 30s. With FDR, because it's like, how do you stabilize farming?
Yeah.
And that's that whole.
So this is a little later then.
Yeah, we'll pay you not to plant.
Yeah.
Right. Because we want to stabilize prices.
So this is much prior to that. Then.
Yeah, this is farmers organizing themselves to basically do what eventually
similar kinds of things.
The federal government steps in, because again, by the early 20th century, World War I is great for farming, but in the aftermath, there's too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. It's like you want to produce, all of a sudden the price goes up because of some artificial demand, which is war, and especially in Europe.
This is why we still have these huge storehouses of cheese and stuff.
Yeah. Or think of like Ukraine right now. Like, what's I don't know this, but what's the acreage that's not being planted in Ukraine that has to do with wheat or something like that. Well, that removes their weight from the market, the global market. So
That's
wheat
right.
prices, I assume, are higher than they should be because of wars happening.
Because of that deprivation.
Right. So then, what if if you're investing in more wheat, and then all of a sudden Ukraine comes back online?
Yeah.
Right.
It's going to change stuff up a little bit.
Yeah, and to me, that's with railroad globalization, but railroads really, it's a gift and it's also a curse, because when the railroad comes to town, you can sell your stuff easier. But the price of commodities, especially with the telegraph, move faster.
Yeah.
And it moves faster than your ability to react.
Yeah. Well, and so can everyone else, right?
Yeah.
Which is part of the...
And then who has the information, like the whole insider trading.
Yeah.
So a lot of, this period is really interesting precisely because of electronic communication that both is a plus, right? It's a blessing and a curse.
Sure.
Right. It changes things in a way that you really have to be. You really have to have an economic partner to upgrade, right? I always think of video games where you got to spend money to upgrade your little thing you're working on, and if you don't have the money, you're falling behind.
Yeah.
And so you're waiting to upgrade your little thing so you can do 500 instead of 250.
Yeah. This is also part of the objection in the context of gaming to like pay to win gaming, where you actually take your real currency and that allows you to in game basically become ultra powerful. So then it is less about anything like skill or just enjoyment of the game or doing things in the game. It's just an immediate connection to how much money are you willing to pay for this, and that's how good you can be or something.
Yeah, and then it's justified because it's all like, well, everyone's volunteer. Like you're not forced to do it.
That's right. Yeah.
Right, and so it's I love those are good conversations, that the purity of the game, right? Like if money's introduced to it, how much corruption comes with it.
Yeah.
Right? I think, and you're buying it. There's a whole markets of buying and selling.
Absolutely.
Different things that people purchase, or the hacks, right? People that can make something and then they turn around and sell it.
Yep.
But the reaction, this kind of happens, this happens in the Depression with repatriation, with Mexican Americans rounded up and sent to Mexico. I want to say at least a third are American citizens, but they're still racially profiled and sent to Mexico. Depressions have that effect, right? You got to find the scapegoat. But this becomes really the road to the end of Reconstruction, and the idea that the South is because African Americans are voting, the government's even more corrupt, and this is you have the Republican James Pike, who writes this sort of report where he talks about the most ignorant democracy mankind has ever seen, right? And describing black lawmakers as, quote, stereotypically ignorant, degraded field hands, racist caricatures, all these sorts of things. And for the American public who, they've been raised, most of them have lived through, decades of slavery, and let alone the culture is just inherently, this is the moment of racial science is really taking off. And so, to say this sort of thing is reconfirming in people's minds, right? What they already sort of believe, those gut level assumptions. And so it really changes American opinion in the North to basically, let the South do what they want. It's none of our business. And that becomes the political capital to really, get rid of, Reconstruction.
Sure.
Same thing with workers' rights. Workers' rights are dealt a setback. When we think of, the 8-hour day, all that stuff comes about like decades later, but this is when, workers are they're fighting for it.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, absurdity. Wait, what, 8 hours a day? Like, you should be working 16.
Yeah.
If you get hurt on the job, it's your fault, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's
2 days off.
Yeah. Like, I can't believe you should just be able to have Sunday, if that, off. And a bunch of court cases kind of move through. One of them is the slaughterhouse cases where you had the idea that the 14th Amendment protected only the rights of federal citizenship, but could not prevent a state from curtailing other individual rights. Right, and this is that kind of double whammy where the 14th Amendment works to help enshrine sort of this immortal corporation. On the other hand, it's supposed to give citizenship, but these court cases are now using the 14th Amendment to say that, no, you can't override states that want to create these laws.
Yeah.
Right, so...
so it goes back to this idea of like the national government versus state government.
Yeah, and this is, you could say in terms of modern, like the modern states' rights idea coming out of the Civil War, this becomes that. The other Supreme Court, decision, 1873, Bradwell versus Illinois decision, and this was about a woman lawyer who was trying to practice law.
Okay.
I want to say her name was, I'd have to look it up. And what Bradley, Supreme Court, or Justice Bradley, what he wrote was basically, this is, the role of women in post-Civil War America, Civil War America. He says there's a wide difference in respective spheres and destinies of man and woman, with men as women's protector, right? That idea that women don't need rights if they're protected by men.
Yeah.
And the idea that there's the timid and delicate women that are firmly in the domestic sphere, right? The harmony of interests and views which she should belong to the family institution is repugnant to the idea of a woman adopting a distinct and independent career from that of her husband. The paramount destiny and mission of woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. Again, we heard that the speech the other
Harrison Butker speech.
And we're kind of at least with I want to say Roe v. Wade, the reversal of that a couple of years ago, it played off this 14th Amendment. So again, this might be history. This is more than, it's 150 years ago.
Yeah,
it's these ideas are still in play.
Absolutely, yeah. Myra Bradwell.
Bradwell. Another Supreme Court, Minor versus Happersett, 74. The Supreme Court says women might be citizens, but citizenship did not automatically include the privilege of suffrage. Right? And so, again, this 1870s
non-voting
moment.
Citizens.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't give you the right to vote. You might be a citizen, but you don't have the right to vote. In a way, that's very much a part of the founders, right? The founders didn't believe that people without property should be able to vote, especially for president.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that we're still, in contemporary society today, we're still dealing with the aftermath of arguing about this. Just because you're a citizen doesn't mean you have rights.
Yeah. What are the privileges of citizenship? What rights are codified or entailed or allowed in relation to that?
Yeah. I guess last here in this, right before we get to the big change of 1877, 1876, you have the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer defeated by the Sioux. It's sort of the last big victory for sort of indigenous groups in North America, right? And in the aftermath of that, you have this steady erosion, right? And you really, in the game, I guess 1899, you see the very tail end, right? Where they're not quite, they're on a reservation. I think it says reservation, but even that is not stable, right? Because they want that, the oil people want. Cornwall, Leviticus wants that land, so they're going to be forced yet again to move. And again, a part of the conflict here is 1875. There's gold discovered in the Dakotas. And that overrides any kind of treaties that allowed indigenous people to stay in this area. It replays sort of that old pattern. And Custer, ironically, is the one that helped lead the 1875, right? Hey, there's gold, and popularized it. So, anyway, the election of 1876 is this famous, right? When in history books, the compromise of 1877. Arguably, like, I think our survey starts in 1877.
The modern world.
Yeah, our modern U.S. history is 1877 to present. So this is kind of one of the traditional kind of cutoffs between colonial to 19th century and then 1877 to present.
Okay.
And it does signal this, right, this shift. But I think, arguably there's never a shift. It's the steady accumulation and buildup of events that leads to a perceived shift, I guess you could say.
Okay.
It's basically Republican Hayes versus Democrat Tilden. Tilden wins the popular vote, right? But Hayes wins the electoral college, right? Which is, again, a familiar sort of, I think that was W and Gore, and then I think it was Clinton and Trump, right? 16. This commission's put together. They vote 8-7 that Hayes won, but Hayes recognized like his tenuous position. So to make the Democrats happy, he basically pulls the troops out of the South, and it's the end of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And it allows the South to reimpose sort of a neo-slavery, sort of this, what becomes Jim Crow.
Yeah. Segregation practices.
Very like outwardly white nationalist. I mean, the government at this point is white nationalist across the country, but in the South it becomes very much, a reimposition of older power relationships. It was interesting too. She talks about ex-Confederate Wade Hampton, who has his army of loyal red shirts, right? And this is his paramilitary group that was terrorizing African Americans out of power. And so I couldn't help but think of the Lemoyne Raiders, right, as sort of playing off these, the ex-Confederates or the people born in the aftermath, but they're now they're the paramilitary wing of. I mean, really the Klan, but it's not necessarily the Klan because the Klan is around, but in the game at least the Klan is they made the Klan a comedic sort of
it's cartoonish.
Bumpkins getting together, and then you're allowed to kill them and not lose honor, right? Alongside that eugenicist,
that's right,
in downtown Saint Denis, but the Lemoyne Raiders are the real deal. Like they are violent, aggressive, and they fit into sort of Hampton's red shirts.
Yeah, it's interesting.
1877 is also the year of the Great Railroad Strike and the use of Alan Pinkerton's Pinkerton Detective Agency, which we get to see in the game.
Yeah.
That's sort of, the Pinkertons come on the stage as, it's what corporations use to break strikes. And constitutionally, I think these are part of the arrangements. Do you have the right to strike? Is it proper? Is it capital's right to exist and to choose how the conditions are? Do workers have rights within that framework? And does a company have the right to hire a paramilitary organization to crush, assassinate, or whatever?
Yeah, to enforce its dictates.
To enforce,
and so it's on the laborers that work.
And so it's usually you read it in a scandalous sense, right? I think as a player, you obviously don't like the Pinkertons because they're the antagonist, I guess. But we have to remember at the time, this is just, nobody knows how to do capitalism in this industrial sense. Nobody knows how to deal with, a vast army of workers who you're trying to squeeze as much work out of with the least amount of pay. But, oh my gosh, they're reacting to that.
Yeah.
And then the best way you deal with it is through force, right?
Yeah.
It's very much, you can see this overseas with imperialism, right? Where you're, oh my gosh, the group of indigenous people that we're trying to force to do things, they're fighting back. What do? Well, we'll bring in, these Maxim guns and make an example out of, a few thousand and see what happens if people change their minds.
Yeah.
This, I think, the same way we were talking about the corporation, there's people forget that nobody knows how this works, how to do it.
Yeah.
Right. So, everyone's sort of kind of feeling out how things operate within this setup. The other thing I think that's interesting, because I want to say it's eastern Colorado, western Kansas.
Okay.
But this 1876 Congress passes the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which prohibits the deployment of the army to enforce the laws, except under a few circumstances. And there's that group that arose, I think, in the 70s and 80s that really caught the attention of the FBI. Right, they're sort of early 3%er type, militia type groups, which is there's always these weird echoes, right, that move through history. The law also, and this is significant, the law also makes it impossible makes it harder for the federal government to protect Native Americans from white settlers or black people in the South.
Yeah.
Because you can't mobilize the army, right? And so again, it's sort of these chess pieces moving into play that create possibilities or foreclose possibilities for different groups of people.
Yeah.
I think moving into sort of the final chapter or towards the end of the readings here, where you get this sense of modern changes, right? The electrical lights that we get to see in Saint Denis, taller buildings, right? There we say skyscraper, right? The first ones in Chicago, 1885. Skilled workers, their wages double over unskilled workers. So there's even sort of in this working class, there's a shift of how much money you make. White collar workers are buying their own homes. Thanksgiving, right? This is one of those I forgot I knew this. 1885, Thanksgiving becomes a major holiday.
That's good.
Christmas, all of a sudden you start using the tradition of the Christmas tree, right? So that becomes a thing. Federal workers, 1885, get Christmas off. You have popular magazines that begin to circulate. Again, this is you need content. So what better content than to write stories about the West? Yeah. Right. So things are, narratives and information are filtering through all these different networks. The 1880s too are sort of prosperous for farmers, right? There's a rise in crops. There's a sense that the post-Civil War economy finally is back on track.
Yeah.
It's also, you have railroads are pretty much not totally in place, but there's enough networks now that you can move goods at a better rate. The volatility of big business, right, by the end of the 70s comes in the form of the trust. Okay. Right, and that's always one of these, I have to look it up. Right, but what you would do is you would consolidate multiple industries into a trust. This is Richardson, in this legal entity, the owners of a corporation put their shares of the business into a trust managed by a board of directors who were empowered to hold, control, and manage all the trust's property. This meant rapid consolidation of industries and control of markets and prices. Right. Again, this kind of goes into when farmers are trying to, how do we control markets and prices to stabilize things? These things are bouncing back and forth between, how do we, again, nobody knows what they're doing.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the thing to keep reminding students, readers. They haven't figured this out yet. Yeah. They're figuring it out. Again, by the 1880s, the Civil Rights Act of 75 is overturned, right? And so this is, a real victory for post-Reconstruction, especially the South, where suddenly, again, arguing that the law was unconstitutional because federal authority could only overrule state institutional discrimination, not the actions of private individuals, right? Yeah. And this played into that, right, that middle class, the idea that African Americans would receive no special treatment from the government.
Yeah.
At the same time as you're moving through the 80s, you have farmers that are increasingly being squeezed by the railroad.
Yeah.
Right. And this leads to, for Kansas, that rise of populism, right? Sort of this radical moment for Kansas, who are, trying to figure out how do you stabilize prices? How do you stabilize the livelihood of small producers?
Yeah.
Again, this sort of theme, the idea that you have populists that are trying to fight back against the railroads. You also have the rise, if you went from trusts, you also went into sort of what you would call holding companies, right? And so the holding company would bring together a number of enterprises under one controlling organization. And this is where, Rockefeller and some of these big names come in, where you're basically buying up steel industries and other related industries, and it's under one umbrella.
Yeah.
Andrew Carnegie writes The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, where he argues that the concentration of wealth and industry in the hands of a few was not only inevitable in an industrial system, but also beneficial so long as the rich used their money wisely.
Yeah.
Civilization itself depended on the protection of property, right? So you're defending, again, this is against strikers.
Sure.
But this idea that, this goes back to sort of that Calvinist, the chosen, sort of the early 1600s, the elect. The wealthy are elected. They should have sort of money. It will trickle down, right? Like, we hear an echo of this, during the 80s moment.
Yeah.
In 1980s, 100 years later.
Yeah.
Was sort of the rise of Reaganism and the idea that if the wealthy will the wealth will trickle down and go into other people's pockets and create opportunities. Again, these are the debates that you wouldn't have to say this or prove it or write an article or a book if there wasn't a discussion that was going against that.
Sure.
You always want to think about why was something said. Well, there was a reason why it was said.
Sure.
Enough people were becoming anti-big business. And I think, the populists were very much at the front of this. And again, when we think of the populists, their ideas don't really get to kick in until the 1930s. When we think of the New Deal, it's really a version of the progressives in the, the 1890s to the early decade before World War I. But it's also these ideas that the populists were putting together, 40 years before the New Deal that finally come, that are put into play.
Or something,
But this idea of the abolition of national banks, right, an increase in paper and silver money, an end to corrupt government, the direct election of senators, right? We forget that senators were appointed, right? So it's like, no, that's unfair because usually it's the oil company lawyer that gets appointed.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they want direct election. But this is important too, the regulation of railroads or even the nationalization of railroads. Right? The idea that railroads are so important, they should be nationalized, which would equalize everyone.
Yeah.
Right. And it's fascinating to, read this stuff that's coming out of Kansas because I can't imagine like what's the percentage of farmers that even today you want to nationalize distribution networks.
Yeah.
Right. Again, it's just this change in time. And then the other part too, I think it's at the end of this, the reserve of land for actual settlers only, which was sort of targeting speculation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Again, these are, these
people coming in from outside, buying it, and then not doing anything with it, not living on it, just holding it or something.
Yeah. And then it forces, again, the speculation forces up the price.
Yeah.
Which makes it harder. So someone that comes in, a small producer, buys it. It's a larger than you thought you were going to pay loan. And then something goes wrong. You're within inches of always failing. And boom, you lost everything. The only person that makes money is the person that's speculating. That's gambling on this thing that also affects people's livelihoods
futures and stuff. Yeah.
Again, when we think of the housing crisis today, like it's a lot of these sort of these patterns are still in play.
Yeah.
I think the other, a couple things in here that I want to say it's towards the end of the game, not to give it away.
Sure.
But the Johnson County War in Wyoming, right? Where you had the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which was a massive, big rancher, cattlemen. They wanted to clear out the smaller cattlemen, and they hired 50 gunmen from Texas to kill their competition. They gave them lists of men to murder. And so this sort of unfolds. The association appealed to the idea that these smaller cattlemen threatened the middle class order. So in a way, they were bad. They got on the PR early, and framed themselves as victims of these smaller cattlemen.
Yeah.
And then that allowed the federal government to come in, to side with them, and it allowed them to get away with murder.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's when we're kind of going through, especially in this game, like it's playing into this. If you're attacking that, the oil refinery place, the federal government will be on your side because there's sort of this relationship of, well, this is my property, regardless of what I'm doing either to the environment or to the people whose land we want, right? Mm-hmm. Indigenous groups. Yeah. I always think of with the pipeline. Mm-hmm. We're still, we're fighting over the federal government coming in to secure pipeline construction
in South Dakota.
Yeah. And so it's how do you right? We're still in this history.
Sure.
The other part too is there's the skyrocketing of lynching of African Americans from the 1880s on. Mm. Right. This is the moment that from the 80s up through the 1930s. These are the most famous lynching photographs where everyone wants to be in the picture, mm-hmm. right? And this kind of plays into, right, the reality, authenticity of creating a game in the past.
Yeah.
And the moral concerns that developers would have to go into this because if we're talking about, like, especially with lynching, or you have, the famous photographs after Wounded Knee, mm-hmm. With everyone's like, yay, look, here's all the dead bodies. Yeah. For women and children that we massacred, you have this weird moment of documentation. Mm-hmm. You have a very self-conscious moment where we're in this picture of someone we just murdered.
Yeah.
Everyone came out for it. It's technically illegal because
mm-hmm.
it went around the court system.
Yeah.
But the mayor and the judge and everyone else is here too.
Yeah.
We're in our Sunday best, so it's a respectable celebration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If there's enough, right? What was that? The frame? The moral.
The scope of the moral community.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We'll be getting into that, but the scope of the moral community is such that it's completely acceptable to participate in. Yeah. In this
because those people don't count. They don't have moral status or not enough to make us. Care that their interests are being violated, their person's being violated, their life is ending.
Yeah, and so there's a really interesting, this the ideal versus this reality. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you put that in the game? Right. We do have Micah, who's sort of the grotesque racist.
Yeah.
But most likely, if we did a true history of the game. And say we're going to have only one person as the exception would most likely be the one person who's sympathetic to Native Americans or African Americans. Yeah. And the majority would be just sort of infused with anti-blackness or, anti-indigenous, right? Like that would be normal. Why would it be otherwise? Yeah. Let alone, women in sort of a gang. Mm-hmm. Would they have the types of roles, right, that are on display in the game? Yeah. Of course, the game is shooting for markets. It's 2017, 2018. Yep. Mm-hmm. And so you have to do certain things. But I think it's I wouldn't condemn the game for that. I think the game, it's the reason why we're doing the class. The game offers it provokes conversation, and if you're looking for real authenticity, don't look for it in a video game.
Sure.
By one of the most successful software producers.
Yeah, that's right.
And again, the class should get you to think about video games in a way that you're not necessarily condemning them on the one hand, but you're understanding them as they're participating in a conversation that goes back pretty far. The other part of this, and we were kind of returning back to that Buffalo Bill, right? The story where, Teddy Roosevelt, his wife passes away in 1884, and he heads west to Dakota, to the Badlands. Yeah. And this is where he kind of comes up with this sense of, right, the ideal American, right, involve this absolute equality of individuals according to their individual merits rather than social status. Yeah. Right. And so he helps personify this. In the West, that is what he saw. Yeah. Right. It's all about there's equality of individuals based on individual merit, which is, right, it's that echo of this middle class ideology of everyone is competing. There shouldn't be special interests that have, favoritism. Yeah. But he also idealized the image of the American West. And this is where that paradox comes in, right? The American West is where he sees this individualism, but the federal government always remained critical for the West. Yeah. Right. The East was always critical for the West, and we can always go back to the cans, right? Sure. The litter that, even in the game which I think I at first it's jarring when you come across in a video game, like, why, this wasn't cleaned up. Yeah. But it's supposed to, right? Yeah. You need to see the litter. Yeah. Right. You eat the can and you just toss it. Yeah. It's not like Arthur's recycling. He's got blue trash bag on his horse. Yeah.
Well, and I think this goes back to what you had mentioned earlier, and that comes up in a number of the sort of additional essays beyond the Richardson book, is this idea about sort of realism in the game or authenticity. And I think that, I think any attempt to evaluate it probably has to recognize that, like, some parts of it are going to be closer to accurate or do that than others, right? And so we don't have as much of there's still, there's still racism in the game that is, like, overtly condemned, right? And there's sexism in the game that's overtly condemned. And we know that it doesn't really match up with what common attitudes might have been at the time. But the inclusion of the can example and a variety of other things in the game show that they're trying to kind of walk a line, right? Of like, and Rockstar has explicitly talked about this too, about like, we want it to be realistic. We want it to, connect with this thing or whatever, right? Yeah. All right. Well, I think we will turn to our philosophy section and our moral theory section. So our readings for this week were 3 chapters from Russ Shafer-Landau's book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. And there's lots of introductory ethical theory books out there. A lot of ways you can get introduced to ethical theory. I think this is one of the better ones. It's one that we've used in our department pretty regularly, at least for the last maybe 5, 8 years. Before that, we commonly use another book. So I guess one thing that I want to mention just kind of at the outset, and we talked last time about the difference between applied ethics, ethical theory, and metaethics. But one thing I want to mention is, our author is not trying to suggest or persuade anyone that, ethics only started in the 17th century or anything like that, right? It's very clear that for a long time, people have been concerned with right and wrong and good and evil, and they've developed, their own kind of thoughts about it, whether that's in the East or the West or really wherever. What we're trying to do is we're trying to take this kind of contemporary philosophical approach and lens, right? When we talked about methodology in the philosophy part, we talked about like the importance of like focused kind of argument, right? And in particular, like trying to work something out in this kind of coherent, systematic way. And so one of the really common and really influential still ethical theories today is consequentialism, or at least particular varieties of consequentialism. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about consequentialism, a little bit about its history and some of its sort of founders, why it's attractive, what some of its problems are, and a lot of that will follow pretty closely with Shafer-Landau text, but also draws in some other stuff. We'll talk a little bit about virtue ethics too, and then I want to end kind of with a discussion of what we introduced earlier as the idea of the scope of the moral community, or another way you can talk about it is the idea of moral status and who or what has it, because I think that this is important. It illuminates differences in ethical theory. It's also something that both our history text and the game are concerned with, which is, who gets to count, right? And who has sort of moral significance, who has to be entered into the moral calculation, if you want to put it that way. So let's just talk about it a little bit. The big thing about consequentialism, and you saw this when you read the book, it's mentioned right away, is the idea that, especially from a utilitarian perspective, what we want to do is get to the greatest good for the greatest number of those affected, right? So one of the key insights in consequentialism is just this idea that consequences matter, and they matter in morality specifically, right? So if you've ever heard the term, the ends justify the means, that's a really kind of often a consequentialist way of thinking, right? Because it says, look, I might have to do this thing that I might recognize in an isolated way or individually as bad, but because of what it produces, right? Because of what it leads to, I'm justified in doing it or something. And there's a host of examples of that, both in history, in interpersonal interaction, in national policy, there's all kinds of stuff like that. The key insight to consequentialism, and one way to think about this is we could imagine a kind of image, so let's just put this kind of picture in your mind, right? Imagine what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what, if I see something wrong has occurred, like a murder has occurred in front of me, right? And I recognize it as wrong. What would we point to? What factor of the situation would we point to that would explain the wrongness of it, right? And different ethical theories are going to tell you different things. They're going to tell you different things of what you should focus on and look at and what is primary or most important. So, a virtue ethics, which we'll get to at the end, would talk about how does it affect your character? What character traits does it display? A consequentialist theory would say, what are the consequences of the action, right? So in the case of murder, right, I've ended a person's life. What the consequences are of that is that they don't exist anymore, right? And if I ended their life innocently, they don't exist anymore, not for any kind of good reason, right? Not for self-defense, not because they deserved it, if that makes sense, not in the context of war, just because, or something like that, right? And a deontological view, or kind of a Kantian view, which we're going to get to next time, would suggest, well, the act itself, right? Murdering a person, trying to murder a person, taking a person's life, that intent and that desire, the act itself is the problem, even if it kind of doesn't go right? So if I pull the trigger and bullet comes out and kills somebody, on a utilitarian view, that's a bad thing because a person's life has been ended. But on a deontological view, if I pull the trigger but it just misfired, I still did something really awful, which is I tried to kill somebody, right? And so one thing we might think about here that is a helpful distinction is, am I focused on my intentions? Am I focused on upholding a specific action or adherence to a rule? Or am I focusing on what are the consequences of my action, right? And a consequentialist ethic is really focused on that consequences of action. And that's really intuitive, right? I mean, we often think one of the real advantages of consequentialism for the most part is it's pretty consistent with a lot of our conventional moral views. And many of those conventional moral views you can make sense of in reference to consequences, right? Why do we, at least now, or many of us maybe, think that something like slavery is so wrong? Well, it deprives someone of something really important, right? It treats someone in this awful way. It leads to all of these negative consequences. That's why it's wrong, right? Why is murder wrong? Why are all sorts of theft wrong? All, again, for the same reasons. We can see what the consequences it leads to, and so that's the thing that we judge it on. So when you think about ethical theory and consequentialism, you're really focused on consequences. I'm going to turn briefly to utilitarianism just because it's probably one of the most, at least in the West, well-developed versions of consequentialism. And if when you've been listening to what I've been saying, if you have any kind of exposure to ethical theory, you might have been thinking, that kind of sounds like utilitarianism. It's because it is really. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. So utilitarianism, I'm so glad that I'm teaching this with someone that's a history person, because I'm not very good always with dates and timelines. So we'll try to get this right if I mistake this, but utilitarianism really starts, I want to say in the, make sure I get this right, maybe late 18th, early 19th century, and kind of continues through there. So Jeremy Bentham, again, I'm bad with dates, so we might have to just readjust this, or I might have to come back with a mea culpa, right, a kind of apology. But so it starts with Jeremy Bentham, who's a British intellectual and author, writer. And then the other big figure in utilitarianism is John Stuart Mill. And so you might have heard of both of these guys. They were both kind of weird and interesting people in different ways. So Bentham, for example, had a lot of weird ideas. His head is actually preserved somewhere. I believe he willed it to a college or university, and for a long time they just had it on display. And because students and people kept like taking weird pictures and playing pranks with it, they had to basically create a replica. So there's a wax version of the head you can see now at, I don't know, some university in England. But the real one, it's like they don't let that out anymore because people were playing with it and messing with it too much.
There's an irony to that, because Bentham came up with the panopticon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right. So if
that's
you've
right.
read Foucault and the panopticon, so
yeah.
The irony is his head's caught and constantly being looked at.
Yes.
And
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Bentham was kind of a weird, interesting guy. His version of utilitarianism was pretty hedonistic. So we didn't read that chapter in our book, but right, the idea behind hedonism is really that either the only or the most important value in life is pleasure, right? And so Bentham is a kind of a non-differentiated hedonist. He said, pushpin, which was kind of a game you would play at a tavern or a bar, or maybe a child would play it. He said pushpin is as good as poetry, which is like there's no gradation in the kinds of pleasures. As long as it has the right kind of intensity, duration, whatever, that's all we care about. And the same thing with pain, right? So there aren't like higher order and lower order pleasures. It's just what we're really concerned about is, we want to preserve pleasure for the most people involved. We want to reduce pain for the most people involved, the things affected, right? And so Mill, John Stuart Mill, the later developer, who's also an interesting figure, his father basically decided he was going to make Mill a genius. And so Mill was like, memorizing Latin poetry at like 5 and doing like mathematical stuff. And it resulted in, maybe unsurprisingly, a kind of break. I mean, he has what people at the time and maybe now we would call like a nervous breakdown. He had some kind of very clear punctuated event in his mental health that basically caused him to kind of rethink his life. And a lot of people think it's because his father basically treated him as like a project instead of like a child that you want to nurture. But nonetheless, Mill was very, very incredibly bright and thoughtful. Mill also was a kind of hedonist, but he did think that you could have higher order and lower order pleasures. So Mill is famous for saying, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, and it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, right? The idea being that not all pleasures are equally good. There might be some that are more worthwhile, right? The contemporary versions of utilitarianism, many of them have moved beyond just sort of a pain and pleasure calculus. Many of them, you could have that kind of hedonistic view, and that's certainly what the earliest forms of utilitarianism were. And part of that was because a lot of the early development of utilitarianism is, it's not only supposed to be an individual moral theory, but it's also supposed to kind of apply politically, right? So at least in England at this time, a part of what's happening is there's a lot of religious division and kind of denominational division, and there's people arguing about this, right? And so part of what Bentham thought he was doing explicitly was developing a moral theory that basically wouldn't be too controversial, right? It's like, what can we all agree on? Maybe we disagree about the Trinity or your interpretation of charity in this church or whatever. What can we agree on? Pain sucks, pleasure's pretty good, right? Those seem to be facts that no one could deny. So that's our starting point. We don't have to get involved in these other things. Good, boom. The other thing utilitarianism was supposed to do, and this is one of its attractions, is it really does have a kind of impartiality. So when I'm trying to figure out the consequences of my behavior, I don't get to say on a utilitarian view, well, what I really want to do is benefit people that look like me, or I want to benefit my family members. Because on a utilitarian view, everyone that is affected has equal kind of moral concern or weight. And part of the reason that was attractive from a political perspective, if Bentham and Mill thought they could get people in government to adopt it, was you wouldn't have as much like cronyism. You wouldn't have as much people that just like are shunting, right, like the kind of contracts of the people they know. They would have to take action based on how it would affect anyone equally, right? And so that kind of impartiality is really an attraction for utilitarianism, and certainly was explicitly part of the rationale for developing it from Bentham and Mill. Now you don't have as much hedonistic utilitarianism. Later writers kind of went beyond it. So the next kind of stage in utilitarianism's evolution is what's called preference satisfaction or desire satisfaction. Right? It might be the case that mostly what I prefer is to be in pleasure and not be in pain, but I have a lot more of other complicated preferences and desires, right? And fulfilling them leads to a kind of happiness or joy that is distinct perhaps from just pleasure. So, and then the final kind of evolution of utilitarianism comes when people maybe even want to go beyond just preference satisfaction and think about what utilitarians would call welfare, right? And so welfare there, all of this is to some extent about your well-being, right? But welfare there is really kind of like what is in your best interest. So oftentimes what is avoiding pain and getting pleasure is in my interest, right? And oftentimes having my preferences or desires fulfilled is in my interest. But there are going to be cases where what's pleasurable is actually not in my interest. So, Dan mentioned earlier that, he likes to work out at a certain time. And sometimes like that is not so pleasurable to work out. Sometimes it is, right? But other times it's like, oh my God, I don't want to do this. My wife and I are going to go work out later. And part of me is like, what I would rather do is just sit in front of the TV and play a video game or something. That'd be more pleasurable, but not good for me, not what's in my interest, right? Because it's in my interest to maybe maintain my health, get in better health, etc. So the idea behind a kind of welfare version of utilitarianism, that idea of welfare is what is in my interest. And what's in my interest can conflict both with pleasure and just what I desire, what my preferences are, right? So you can do a version of utilitarianism that does any of these things, but the point is, one thing you've got to do is you have to think about what are the consequences of my action, right? My course of action, my behavior. Who all will it affect? This is the other really important part of utilitarianism is necessarily if a creature that can suffer is affected by my behavior, I have to calculate the impact it's going to have on them. I can't pretend it doesn't matter, and I can't give them like less sort of moral significance or worth or something. And of course, because actions are very complicated and often lead to a number of consequences, right? There isn't often just one single linear pathway. Well, then I'm going to have to maybe weigh things, right? So then if I say I'm going to have a policy about, one of the things that is discussed in our chapter is this idea of vicarious killing or exemplary killing, right? Like I kill someone to make an example of them. Well, I have to weigh what are the negative consequences and the harms that are going to be associated with that to everyone affected, and what are the benefits that are going to be associated with everyone affected, right? One of the really interesting things about the history or development of utilitarianism, and undoubtedly this is, I'm sure, more complicated in certain ways, but, utilitarians were among the first, Western moral theorists, I would say, who really focused on the idea that like animals should be involved in the moral calculus. So if we think about that scope of the moral community stuff, I don't remember if it's Bentham or Mill, but they said, the question isn't can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? The idea being like the ability to suffer is minimally required for moral status or inclusion in the scope of the moral community or something like that. And of course, at the time, this would have been, this was obviously a couple centuries earlier, but Descartes at one point talks about how, because animals don't have souls, they don't have like anything like consciousness like we have. When you step on the tail of a cat and it screeches, it's not really exhibiting pain. It's just like when you bump a wooden desk and the joists rub together and make a weird noise. It's a mechanical output of a process, but doesn't indicate any actual kind of pain or anything. That's quite a far cry from someone like Bentham or Mill or other utilitarians would say, look, if they feel pain, you got to calculate them too, which means now we have to think about our actions in a much different way than I think a lot of other moral theories and a lot of other outlooks would. Utilitarianism is also pretty early, an early example. Mill, I think, has a little more of maybe a questionable history with this, but Bentham was at least explicitly and very publicly an abolitionist. And Mill, he wrote a book called On the Subjection of Women that was really one of the first written works that basically said the way that we are treating women is unsustainable and immoral, right, in society. And it had to do with those consequences, but it also had to do with this idea that there's no real morally relevant difference that would ground excluding women from opportunities to get education or to own property or other kinds of things, right? And so I think that's really intuitive. Now, right, we think of it now as being very intuitive, but when utilitarianism is first developed, it's not. It seems very kind of radical. And even now, there are a lot of utilitarians whose views seem pretty radical. So Peter Singer is a contemporary utilitarian, and he's a controversial figure on several different axes. But one of the things that he initially was, one of the initial reasons that he was controversial is he really did a lot to kind of try to put in the forefront something like, not an animal rights movement, because utilitarianism it doesn't really neatly mesh with a view where rights are a central consideration, but the idea that I have to treat animals equally. I can't just say because we're a different species, I get to harvest you or do research on you for cosmetic or medical purposes. The idea was, no, that's species membership is a morally irrelevant difference. So that can't be the reason that we can treat them this way or something, right? And he got a lot of hate for that. He's one of the rare relevant philosophers in the 21st century who got death threats. And he's also now controversial for, he has, his view of utilitarianism commits him to some things that disability studies and disability rights advocates find also morally troubling or objectionable. So, and part of that might be a real insight into just utilitarianism or moral theory, right? There's no perfect moral theory that doesn't have certain implications that are troubling or that seem unreasonable to us or that we have moral significant disagreement about. That's true of any coherent, careful, well worked out moral theory.
It's interesting because this is, like Stuart Mill, I think,
yes,
1806 to 73. So he's living through the 1800s.
Yes.
And all this is coinciding with sort of that second wave of colonization. So you could say the Opium War is early, or an early version of imperialism, which by the end of the century becomes, the defining moment that really helps enable us to even say Western civilization.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because it does seem to, it's very Enlightenment inspired.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? But there's also this kind of a romanticism about it because it's like they're definitely playing with relativity in a way, because you're gambling with it. So if I do this, the best it can do is this, the worst it can do is this, and then that becomes the slippery part, right? So anytime you're trying to, one of the difficulties with utilitarianism and really any kind of consequentialism is how effectively can we project in the future what the consequences of an action will be, right? Yeah, and there's I guess the language of this has a technocratic sense to it. I keep thinking of Bentham with the pen, the way that he's really this kind of technocrat, a proto-technocrat in this, and they're writing at this moment when you have the rise of racial science, and all that coincides in the wake of abolition, right, into slavery. Yeah. But it also coincides with sort of the scramble for Africa, right? And the idea that imperialism is not just, and they'd always point to the Spanish, raping and pillaging Mexico, right, with the Aztec, all that. We don't do that. We are Northern Europeans. Right, it's playing into that kind of racial.
There's a gentility to it.
Superiority. Like it's very British, right? Because the British are sort of the top. But it allows you to use language to do brutal acts.
Sure.
Right. And I keep thinking, the other one I keep thinking it's derived from this is, the famous quote from during the Vietnam War where he said, "We had to destroy the village to save it."
Yeah.
Right. Like the ultimate sort of absurdity. We had to massacre these natives to civilize them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
During the different wars in Africa during the imperial era, or the phrase "exterminate all the brutes."
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's right.
To do that is going to save civilization.
Yes.
The best of humanity will be saved when you exterminate the brutes. Yeah. And I guess I'm not saying that it's connected to these philosophers, but
of course.
It's the way that the language is then mobilized to.
Yeah.
Right. We're gonna make what we're doing respectable.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think that from a certain point of view, the idea that this idea that like sometimes the outcome of a situation justifies the means to get there. I think something like that is probably like very old, right?
Yeah.
I mean, certainly lots of people have had to figure out like, okay, if I act, say, I think about some of the discussion of how, there's discussion about how like during the Revolutionary War or whatever, you have these like British field officers who are like lining up and engaging in the rules of warfare. And then you have other people that are just like, we're in war. Like, we're going to do guerrilla warfare. We're going to do anything we can. And then people feel like, oh, but this isn't fair anymore or something, right? Like, so, I mean, one way to think about this general issue is to think like, are there going to be cases where the consequences of something is so good or so bad that even if I have to violate some other kind of moral rule or some other norm, that I should do that, like I ought to do it, right?
Yeah.
Thinking back to our moral vocabulary stuff, not only that it's morally permissible, but that it's actually obligatory, like you are required to do it. Right?
You think of the atomic bomb, the dropping.
This is certainly often that's why it's that is at least how it's commonly justified, right? Is
we're saving millions by...
Yes, if we do a land invasion into Japan, it's going to cause lots of problems, not only for U.S. troops, but also Japanese troops and Japanese civilians. And so in the long run, this actually is better for everyone or something like that, right? So the idea, I think, the idea of this, I think, is, there have been times I've found utilitarianism really attractive, right? The idea of impartiality is good. There's moral flexibility, which is really good, right? So when I go into a situation on a utilitarian view, I'm not just, rigidly bound to a particular rule. I actually have to figure out, okay, like, who are the actual people affected and what are the effect likely to be? The expected versus actual results is a real difficulty here, right? And then I have to figure it out, right? So, Shafer-Landau gives this example of, suppose that, a friend wants me to tell her the truth or him the truth about what someone said about them. And, I might know a lot of specific situations that make me think probably I should lie in this case, even if there's a general prohibition against lying, right? There are other ethical theories that are really focused on following rules and doing the right act no matter the consequences, right? Kantian theory kind of gets painted with that brush, and it's to some extent true. And so there's a kind of inflexibility in that, and utilitarianism says, no. Moral life is messy and complicated, and we need to actually figure out who's affected and what the effects are likely to be. And so we're not going to be able to just get like an easy book of rules, right? So that's really attractive about it. That impartiality can be attractive. It can also be something that's kind of a problem, which we'll see when we get to feminist ethics, and also just thinking about what sometimes philosophers will refer to as special relationships. So, on a utilitarian view, if you see one of your children and another child drowning, on a utilitarian view, you shouldn't really prefer your child because they're both human beings, they're both individuals. So, what's the right thing to do? I'm not sure if it's flip a coin, but you can't just say, well, to hell with that other kid, I have to, save my child. But that seems really intuitive to us that like sometimes you do have special obligations that are generated by particular relationships that do not hold more broadly. And so that impartiality that is sometimes an advantage can kind of be seen as a reason to object, which we'll see later. But the moral flexibility, the impartiality, the idea that it at least starts at a level where At least the authors thought we wouldn't have any disagreement. Now, of course, it's hard to, you can disagree about just about everything, right? As philosophers and lots of people in history, other academics show. But the idea is that, look, here's the thing we can all agree on: pain, unless there's other stuff attached to it, probably generally to be avoided, not good, and pleasure, pretty good, right? And so those are some real advantages of it. The other thing that it tries to do, the difficulty, one of the reasons that philosophers and just people in general, I think, are attracted to theory is theories help tell you what to do in particular situations, right? And so, if I just dealt with a, say, ethical dilemma, and I've just got to figure out what I should do in this particular case, if I have a real conflict, well, it might be the case that I just kind of do whatever I feel like at the time, but I don't really have a principled reason for why I do one thing over another. All these theories at least give us principled reasons of why we should, say, defer to the best consequences, for example, or focus on not treating the person as a means to an end, as Kant will say later, right? So there's some real attractions to it. Again, that idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, it just doesn't mean like everyone gets to be happy, and it doesn't mean, what I have to do is do the thing that will make everyone happy. It's a little more complicated than that, right? I have to judge like how much pain is it going to cause. If it's not going to affect some group of people, then they don't get counted in it, right? And so there's like, it's not just like I'm trying to make everyone happy. It's not just like bread and circuses, right? It's supposed to be what real tangible benefits and consequences would this course of action have? What real tangible negative effects would it have? And then I have to sort of figure out the trade-off, right? So the greatest good for the greatest number might mean that there's still some people that are really unhappy, but that's necessary to get to this point or something, right? So one of the problems with it, so we just talked about some of the attractions to it. And again, to be clear, maybe it's helpful to say this or maybe not. I'm the kind of person that I find myself, I'm trying to think of how to put this. I find myself like eminently attracted to an argument. And so if you've got a good argument on one side of something, I'm probably going to, after reading it and thinking about it, go, oh yeah, that's pretty good. And then I'm going to read an objection and go, oh yeah, that's a real problem too, right? And so I certainly have found utilitarianism attractive at different points in my life. And there are a lot of contemporary moral theorists who are utilitarians of various kinds. But there are some real problems and difficulties that utilitarianism and really any form of consequentialism to some extent would have to deal with. And so I want to talk briefly about those a little bit before we get into virtue theory and the scope of the moral community. So there's some obvious problems with utilitarianism. One is that there's really no place for rights in utilitarianism, or really like things having intrinsic goodness, actions, say, or badness aside from their consequences. On utilitarianism, it's all about those consequences, right? So if what I have to do to bring about the best consequences, and maybe this is kind of dovetailing into your point, Dan, is to do some really horrific atrocity, but if that will bring out the greatest consequences for the greatest number of those involved, I'm justified in doing it, right? And so you can think about this as an issue about the intrinsic badness of actions, but it also leads into or goodness of actions, regardless. But it also leads to another potential issue in utilitarianism, which is that utilitarianism has always had a kind of problem with justice, right? And so one way to think about this, and Shafer-Landau talks about this, sometimes you can think of an ethical theory or the point of, say, an action to be forward-looking, right? So the example that he gives early on is the death penalty. One way, a very consequentialist way of thinking about the death penalty is, well, look, what are the effects going to be? Is it actually going to deter criminals? Is it actually going to make society a better place? Is it going to have these long-term consequences to go? If not, we shouldn't do it, right? There's another way to think about the death penalty that represents a wholly different kind of moral outlook, which is more past-looking, right? Instead of looking forward to what are the consequences going to be in the future, it's what are the circumstances that led to this, and do they justify the action regardless of those consequences, right? So one way to think about the death penalty is you might think some actions are so immoral or so horrific that the only appropriate kind of justice is they be paid back in a certain way or something, right? And that would be the case even if there aren't all these really good consequences. Those would kind of be secondary, right? So more broadly thinking about this, since utilitarianism and really consequentialism are solely focused on what good consequences will be brought about, then justice just sits uneasily with that. Because justice is really, I mean, if you think about it, justice, and you can think about justice a number of different ways, think about it distributively or procedurally or any other kind of way, but what it's really about is something like fairness and the idea that people get their due, right? And sometimes to make something, to produce something that would cause to have the greatest consequences would require some injustice. And potentially, right, I mean, vice versa. It might be the case that serving the interests of justice actually do not promote these really good consequences. And that's okay, right, if you're more justice focused, if that's more your perspective. But utilitarianism just sits uneasily with that because the guiding criterion, right, for a utilitarian view is, does it produce these good consequences? Now, utilitarians have argued, well, most of the time, justice is a thing that if you serve it, it produces good consequences. So most of the time, this conflict doesn't arise. But certainly, it's a real concern because if you think that what's going to end up happening as a result of this, say, injustice on this single individual, even if it's minor or whatever, is all of these really good consequences for everyone else involved, that would justify it in a way that if we think that justice is really central, that doesn't fit very easily with the utilitarian perspective. And there's been, this is an ethical theory that is still an ethical theory that people are writing about. So there's still a lot of discussion and debate and argument and objection in response to all of this. But it is just on the face of it a problem, a real problem. And then going back to that idea of impartiality, utilitarianism does seem to require that I don't treat other people any differently. I don't treat my family any differently than I treat others. Because again, they all have the same kind of moral status and it would be unfair, right? We don't want that cronyism. We don't want that partiality. But you might think that partiality is relevant and actually not only morally relevant, but really important. Certainly it seems intuitive to us that, for example, I have greater obligations to a friend or a family member or my romantic partner than I do just to other humans in general. Maybe I still have obligations to them, but because of the nature of my relationship with those people, you might think I have a different set of obligations to them.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you're going through this.
Sure.
There's so many times in the game, because, the story missions, you have to do certain things. Right?
Yeah.
You're forced to engage in things that you might not choose to do.
Yeah.
I think, as students go through this, you're forced to deal with, you're literally walking through these theories.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because to get to the next step, you have to do something that's unpleasant.
Yeah.
Or, in those instances where the NPC or, do what you want with the person.
Yeah,
so
when Dutch says, hey, here are these leftover raiders or these O'Driscolls or whatever,
do what you
want.
decide
what to do with them.
Yeah, so you can either execute them right there or you can let them go.
Yeah. And one way to think about that is on a kind of utilitarian calculus, right? I mean, one thing Dutch says in one of those cases is, do whatever you want with them, just make sure they don't set people on us, right? And presumably that, one way to think about that is he's saying, look, if you let them go and they, tell, well, then a bunch of people are going to come after us and possibly kill us. That's bad. So if you need to take care of them, if you need to kill them, do that. But if not, that's okay. Just prevent them from doing anything that's going to lead to this negative consequence for us, right?
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. I think that's definitely in there. Let's talk just briefly maybe about virtue theory before we talk about the scope of the moral community, and I want to come back to that too. Virtue theory is the other thing you read about, and virtue theory is really interesting because, at least in Western academic philosophy, you kind of see it disappear. I mean, when Kantian moral theory comes up and when utilitarianism comes up, that really dominates the discussion of moral theory for the better part of 150 years or so. Maybe 100, maybe we should say that. And part of the reason is because people mostly just thought virtues were kind of this, quaint old thing, but it wasn't really a real theory. So in the history of philosophy, of course, you have Aristotle and Plato. A lot of people interpret Confucianism as a kind of virtue theoretical ethical system. So you have Confucius or, Kongzi, Mencius or Mengzi and Xunzi. all doing Confucianism in a way that, at least for Mencius especially, you can see what looks like a lot of virtue theory. And of course, virtue theory becomes popular in the Middle Ages because, one way to interpret Christianity is as a kind of virtue theory. A lot of people interpret it more as a rule-based, like deontological theory, but there's disagreement about that. The point, of course, is just that, so this idea of virtues, right, and character traits, that's what's central to virtue theory. It's less about what should I do, what action should I take, but what kind of person do I want to be, right? And the question about the kind of person you want to be is going to relate to actions you take, but it's also going to relate to, like, what are your character traits? How do you reliably behave given certain situations and certain setups? It has to do with your motivations and your feelings, right? Your emotions. And so virtue theory really kind of comes back into vogue, at least in 20th century American philosophy, with Alasdair MacIntyre wrote this book called After Virtue that was really, I think, historically important in kind of reintroducing that. A lot of there was this group of 4 women philosophers after, I think, the Second World War, maybe the First World War in Britain. Mary Midgley, what was her name? Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, and then G.E.M. Anscombe, who did a lot of ethical theory that really went outside of what most people at Oxford at the time would have been doing, or were either utilitarians or were Kantians, right? Those are like the 2 big ways to do it. And Anscombe in particular and Foot in particular really try to reintroduce this idea of virtue as a real point of moral theorizing. So there, I'm less concerned about what action should I take in a given situation. I'm not doing moral calculation. What I'm really trying to figure out is, like, what kind of person should I be? And so that's going to involve a lot of different stuff, right? So Aristotle, for example, notes that, excellence is a matter of what we do and not just what we think, right? So if I want to be a compassionate person, that means I need to act in a certain way reliably, motivated by the right things with attendant emotions. So this idea of virtue theory involves both your behavior, but it also involves, like, your inner life too. Like, what emotions are you feeling? What is motivating you? What are your intentions, etc. And ultimately, someone like Aristotle, and really even contemporary virtue theorists, think that a lot of that has to do with, like, your development and training, right? So your moral education is important in the sense of, like, if you start learning something as a child, you're going to go a lot farther than if you try to pick something up at 30 or 40 or something, right? And the same thing is true on this view about developing virtues, right? It's not that I couldn't develop some significant virtue as late in life, but it's just going to be harder, right? Whereas, children their brains are so malleable and plastic, their behavior is still so early that really you could, if you train them to say, be compassionate or be courageous, that's more likely to hold over time, right? Because it just takes time. It takes experience. The other thing it takes, right, just in addition to education, is experience. So you don't have these, super intuitive child moral geniuses, right? Because they're children. They don't have a lot of life experience. And part of what comes with this idea of virtue is this idea of moral wisdom, right? And that is really knowing how to apply certain moral considerations based on particular circumstances. So one of the advantages of virtue theory has long been thought to be kind of like with utilitarianism, it's flexibility. The virtue theorist doesn't say there's a book of rules, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not do this or that. It says, the wise person recognizes that the right action is heavily dependent on circumstances and heavily dependent on facts on the ground. And the practically wise person will almost kind of have this intuitive sense of how to respond, right? If you don't have that, then most of us mortals, because most of us don't have that, what you try to do is you really try to, and this is how Shafer-Landau talks about it. He talks about it as an exemplarist style theory. You look for moral exemplars and you try to figure out kind of what would they do. So, when I was growing up, the little wristbands that said WWJD were really popular, right? That's what would Jesus do? That's a way to think about moral exemplarism, right? It's like I'm looking at a moral exemplar and saying, what would they do? Of course, you could do it with Jesus. You could do it with the Buddha. You could do it with non-religious figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. But the point is, if there's a moral exemplar, then that is a way you can figure out what to do. Is what would the good person, what would the practically wise person do in this case? That's what helps guide me. But it turns out that is complicated and difficult It does have a significant role for the emotions, which is different than some other moral theories. Kant's moral theory is really heavily focused on rationality, but virtue theory sees emotions as both kind of guides and indicators to maybe to how the world is that we don't consciously pick up, but also they're important to have that kind of virtue, right? So like for example, Confucius says this in the Analects. He says, being filial, that's being a good child to a parent, can't just be because you provide, say, a place to live and some food for your parents when they get beyond the age to work, because we do that for animals, and that's not enough, right? So part of the idea might be like, I can't really be compassionate if I'm going through the motions, but inside I'm just like, ugh, these poor people, or whatever it is, right? Whatever group that I'm trying to be compassionate towards, I should be motivated by the right kinds of things. I should have the right kind of attendant emotions. If I'm constantly doing it begrudgingly, or if I'm constantly doing it because I hate it, but I feel like I'm called to, that's a really imperfect level of your moral development on a virtue theory view. Some of the problems of virtue theory is people don't find it particularly practical. So to say I should be courageous or wise, I might go, okay, but what does that mean in this situation? And some people will say virtue theory doesn't have a lot to say about that. So it is not action guiding in the way that some of the other ethical theories are. Again, virtue theorists would disagree about this, but it's one of the objections. I think one of the biggest, at least theoretical objections to virtue theory is it doesn't seem to have any, well, a lot of virtue theories don't seem to have a way to prioritize different virtues. So for example, if I have the virtue of, compassion, and I also have the virtue of acting justly, right? Well, mercy is usually doing something that goes beyond justice, right? I'm doing something that I don't have to do. I'm not obligated to do as a kindness. I'm extending grace or something. But those things conflict. So when I have these virtues that conflict, how do I navigate that and deal with that? What is the priority? There are some virtue theories, like Aristotle's virtue theory, treats the virtues as basically all connected. So he thought you couldn't really have one unless you had the others, but most contemporary people don't think that's true, just given our psychological diversity and compartmentalization and stuff. But there is still a question of if I have, say, compassion and courage, and those conflict, it's hard to see what priority I would give to any given virtue if two virtues conflict. It's also the case, in addition to sort of not being action guiding and stuff, it's, another potential difficulty with virtue theory is just, to some people it still doesn't really seem much like a theory, because there's a lot of disagreement, say, as to who the moral exemplars are, what should be included in the list of virtues, right? The list of quote-unquote Christian virtues there's some overlap, but they're also quite different than ancient Greek virtues. Those are different than the virtues that you see extolled in Confucianism, if you interpret Confucianism as a kind of virtue theory. So there's still a good question about all of this. And some people will say that's a problem. Virtue theorists usually just say, this is true of any moral theory. There are always difficulties in moral theory. There's always difficulty prioritizing stuff. There's difficulty applying it. And there's always difficulty in figuring out what's right. So one thing I maybe want to end with before we get to the scope of the moral community, and I'll try to be brief about this, is there are distinctions between the epistemic and the metaphysical. And so, if you're a kind of moral realist, which you don't have to be, but certainly a lot of these people like Aristotle was and Mill was, you might think that there is some fact of the matter. Maybe it's this abstract proposition about like what consequences actually will occur because of this action or something. It's totally different to know that, right? And similarly, suppose you're a realist and you think there is some set of virtues based on the kind of thing we are as human beings, because a lot of virtue theory thinks of us as the virtues are related to the particulars of our being human, right? That if we were a totally different kind of thing, we might have different virtues or something. So supposing that there is some actual list of the virtues of humans, which there might not be, but if there were, that there is such a thing and how we would come to know it are separable, right? And so, there could be a skepticism about it, but no, that skepticism is really, I think, less about, or at least I don't think it doesn't have to be about the metaphysical or the metaethical view. It could be, I'm skeptical because I have a hard time figuring out which of these things I should adopt. But I might just be wrong about some of them or something. I mean, there are, I think, One way to think about this, on Aristotle's view, for example, there are going to be ways that human beings live that are just not very good for themselves, for each other, for communities, for groups. And I think, one thing we do sometimes is we do think about that when we think about the people we care about and love in our life, right? You might think, I want to be pluralistic and I want to be open to a lot of ways to live a good life. But then, maybe that means it's hard to have a conversation with my friend who's a heroin addict because I think they're not living a good life and it's bad for them and their family and stuff. But if I want to just really focus on, say, autonomy, maybe I just let them do that. Or if I want to say, well, I can't know that their life is really any worse, that matches some big moral connection to goodness, well, then I want to not say anything about it. And so I think it's a complicated human matter. The final thing I want to talk about, I'm sorry, I just said a lot of stuff. Do you have any questions or thoughts? Okay, we'll just go on. The final thing, and I'll just briefly introduce it and we'll get to the Red Dead book and these essays, is I want us to just keep in mind this idea of the scope of the moral community, or if you don't like that, you can talk about it as like the moral status of entities or individuals or whatever. So one thing we can do, and one way you can think about this is you could draw kind of concentric circles, right? So in the middle is you, and then, as you develop as a human being, you start maybe extending your moral compunctions or whatever to your family, right? The immediate people near you. And then maybe eventually your friends or loved ones. And then at some point, your neighbors. And then eventually, maybe again, we keep expanding this circle to maybe just other human beings. And so the question of that idea is just, who counts, who has moral status, or what kinds of things even have moral status? And one way I think, the reason I think this is important to think about is not only do different ethical theories on this differ, but one way, and certainly not the only way, to understand the wrongness of something like sexism or the wrongness of something like racism is it is not appropriately including those individuals in the scope of the moral community, right? And so, your discussion of like the scientific racism stuff, right? A lot of that is people saying, well, look, here are these supposed differences, metaphysically maybe, between this group of people and this group of people, or this ethnicity and that ethnicity, and that justifies not including them in the scope of the moral community, right? They don't have this level of rationality, suppose. They don't have this level of culture, or whatever the reason is supposed to be, and that's a reason to exclude them, right, from the moral community. So then we don't have to take their interests as seriously. We don't have to consider what we're doing to them because they're not in the same group as us or something, and they don't deserve that same kind of moral treatment because they don't have the same moral status, right? So the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it really connects with a lot of our discussion about sexism and racism, both in the game, in this historical period of time, now, all of that, right? But also I think it's interesting because, one of the things that's discussed and we see in the game is the relationship of human beings to nature and human beings to animals, right? And so that's another question, right? Are animals members of the moral community? I think most of us intuitively I would hope most people listening to this want to say, all human beings are members of the moral community, right? And that's maybe a significant change from how people have thought in the past. But I would guess that if you're taking this class and listening to this, that's probably very intuitive to you. But what might not be so intuitive is whether animals have any moral status, right? Or non-living things entirely, or living things like plants. I mean, all of this question is just like, what has moral status and how do we take those interests into consideration when we make moral judgment? And that's something I want to think about because I think that this is, again, one way to interpret the wrongs of some of these things is people insufficiently extending that, right? So if I'm, say, an egotist, and I think the only real thing that matters is me and what serves me, then my scope of the moral community is very small. It's just me, right? And then if I'm someone who says, well, all I'm really looking out for is my family, everyone else, too bad. If something bad happens to them, it's not my kind of responsibility, then maybe I'm again drawing it, but I'm drawing it pretty in a circumscribed way, right? And so one way to think about moral development, if you think there's been moral development, which I think a lot of philosophers do, but I know that this is like something that other people are skeptical of. One way to think about that is as an attempt to continue expanding the circle of the scope of the moral community.
Well, it's interesting because, especially with the animals, right? Because and you're supposed to hunt.
Yes, so that's right.
You're hunting all different kinds of animals.
Yeah.
And then there's only certain animals that you can actually interact with, which would be the horse you ride.
Yep.
So there's all the different interactions with the horse. You can
That's right.
feed, pat it.
Yeah.
You can calm the horse.
That's right. Increase the bond between you and the horse.
The bond. But then the random dogs.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can interact a bunch of different ways with the dog.
That's right.
The first time I played it, I'm thinking, because Fallout has dog meat as a potential companion. Yeah. I was thinking like, oh my gosh, can you get a dog to just be with you on everything? And so I thought like, oh, you develop a bond with the dog, but it
doesn't really come to fruition.
It doesn't work that way. Yeah. But so it's kind of, you don't really need to have that in the game.
Yeah.
There's not a version of that with cats.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, there's a cat. I'm going to go play with the cat. Like, you can always play with the dog, but you can't play with the cat.
Yeah.
You're not going to do that with a pig.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's particularly interesting because, one way to think about this is, I mean, a lot of people who I think don't really mind animals being treated really badly, they still are against animal cruelty or something, right? Yeah. So even people who think that, testing like cosmetics and medical research testing on animals or industrial agriculture, a lot of people that don't have any objections to that still don't think you should just it's okay to randomly torture a cat you find on the street, right? And so I think what that shows us is intuitively we do think animals have some moral status, but we also usually think it's way less than ours, if they have any at all, because again, we do often treat them in ways that we would almost always find objectionable, or at least I think now a lot of people would find objectionable to treat other human beings that way. And for us, we're used to, the idea of a horse is almost less right? Horse isn't really livestock, it's more a domestic animal. It's a use animal, right? Mm-hmm. But dogs and cats, go kind of from being maybe at early points in the human development, use animals to being like domestic animals, like partners, parts of the family and stuff, right? Which also explains why sometimes, when people from America or people in the West see other areas where, say, dogs or cats are kept as livestock animals and not domestic animals, we have a really strong, often reaction to that, right? Yeah. But it's certainly not one substantiated by, there's no reason to think, for example, that cats and dogs are a lot smarter than, say, pigs, for instance, or something, right? And so it isn't any particular quality of the kind of animal. It's really just we have this attachment, and so I would never think of eating this puppy or this cat or whatever, but we would have no real problem doing the same thing to a pig or a cow or something, right? And so I think it's interesting just to think about that in relation to this idea of the moral community and to what extent they have it. Another thing we might come up here as a piece of kind of terminology is some people will make a distinction between moral patients and moral agents. Moral patients are, say, individuals who can't deliberate and can't engage morally, but still are the kind of recipients of appropriate moral or immoral action. Whereas moral agents are people who they both have the moral status of patients, but they can interact. So, sometimes people will say, well, look, it's silly to treat animals as if they had rights, because to have rights, you have to deliberate, and you have to be part of a community, and you have to be able to explain your viewpoint and engage in moral reasoning. And no one is going around thinking lions have done something immoral by being predators and chasing around and eating gazelles, but we don't think that they can engage in moral reasoning. They're not having a communication session with lions like, hey guys, should we stop eating gazelles or something? Nothing like that's happening, right? And some people thought that means they should be excluded from the moral community. The thing that Shafer-Landau brings up, which he says he doesn't really like the language of, is what's sometimes called the marginal cases. And the point there is there are human beings through developmental disability or through brain injury or through a number of things that also don't have those capabilities. And so he thinks, and this is kind of a utilitarian or consequentialist point, if what we need for minimal moral status is the ability to suffer or to have our interests thwarted, then animals do too, right? Even if they don't engage in that. So moral agents are those individuals who can, I can morally deliberate and reason. We can talk about whether something's moral or immoral. I can reflect on my behavior and stuff. And animals, most animals, probably all animals, can't do that, right? Or we couldn't understand that they could do it. But there are also humans that can't do that. And so those humans would also fall under moral patience, and you still might think you have obligations to them, even if they can't engage in a robust discussion of morality with you, right? So, and so I just want us to keep in mind that idea of the scope of moral community, because it's going to come up again and again throughout the game, in the history context, even if it's not used that terminology, and in our additional textbook. So I think that leads us nicely into our additional textbook. Do you want to start? We had 4 readings. I think we decided that we're each going to just talk about one of them. So do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I mean, I guess it kind of plays into
it does,
the scope of the moral community.
Yes, yeah.
I guess it's Nicholas Blower's Ecological Outlaws, Slow Violence, and Natural Encounter, where he uses Rob Nixon's definition. So violence as gradually occurring out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is not viewed as violence at all. And this obviously comes through with like the environment. And so in the game, and it kind of goes through sort of the early video games, 70s, 80s, and this is that balance between sort of reality or realism or authenticity with sort of an ideal. Where, the ideal in people's minds, the idea the West is this pristine, untapped nature. And, you get these ideas, and again, we can think of the Ansel Adams photography, where in the 20th century that helped to reinforce these ideas. But then, you play the game, and we'll probably keep talking about this. And then that's, there's in the Limericks book, where she talks about, like in Montana, the person that was, the diary was, we were just surrounded by mountains of cans of canned goods that we get from the East to eat. And it's just litter. And you move on, and the litter just stays and sits until it's buried or someone comes and picks it up.
That's right.
And so there's that level of sort of, environmental impacts. But, as you move, I don't know, it's in that western edge too. When you're especially when you get near towns, you see sort of clear cutting. You see, if you get further east, there's that, I can't remember the name of the lake, but the lake that's polluted. And I think you can catch messed up fish in it. Right? I don't think you're supposed to eat them. And so to have that in a video game is new. And again, I think when, anyone playing the game, you're always, that's a part of the jarring aspect, because as you go into it, at least in that first chapter, you're in the snow, it's miserable. But from a modern view, you're like, well, I'm inside my car looking at this. It's just snowing outside. Right. So it's not too bad. Plus, I'm playing a computer game, and I'm not really feeling the cold.
Farther removed from it.
When you start coming out of the mountains, and I remember how spectacular that was the first time you played.
Absolutely,
And you are coming down the hill. You're just like, wow, this is incredible. And that's when you're seduced into that idealized, pristine environment.
Well, and also I think just this idea of a way to appreciate. It's not an accident that the game has cinematic mode for when you're on those like long horse rides, right? Because it is so just richly rendered, and it is so beautiful.
To the point on my computer, it says something like, it's running too hot, it could crash.
That's right.
There's a little warning every once in a while. But the other part, and I think this is important, it would be interesting, what they could do with this is when shooting animals in games, in this game, they don't disappear. So in other games, you could shoot an animal and it might disappear. And part of that is graphics. How do you render a dead animal? And then it's just a lot of, no one wants to deal with that.
That's right.
Get to the next fun part.
So we'll just make it symbolic or.
And so in this, when you're hunting, you shoot, and then you have the carcass. Then you have to go and deal with the carcass.
Skin it, or
you do the skinning little.
Yeah.
And it even depends on how you kill it.
Yeah.
So you want to maybe use a bow and hit it in the head, so you get a good,
just get a perfect hide.
Perfect hide. Yeah. You don't want to use a shotgun; that will decrease the value. Yeah. But the main thing is once it makes the hunting messy.
Yes, it does.
At the other end, it repopulates, and you can just keep hunting as long as you want, because they'll respawn.
Yep.
Animals will always respawn, and so in many ways that it undermines any sense of thinking about the environment as with humans having an impact on it. Yeah. The game that popped into my head as I was talking about this, there was, I think it's Age of Empires, the old 90s going into the early 2000s, where you would send people out and they would mine. I think there's farming, and then there's cutting the trees down. Yeah. But each time, there's only so many trees. Yeah. There was a timer going on how many trees you could cut down. I think the mines went dry, and so then you'd have to find somewhere else. And a part of the strategy is building up your side before the other side comes and attacks. Yeah. But you can't cut everything. Yeah. So there's a lot of decisions, and within this, they have the idea that industry is polluting and clear cutting, but at least with the animals, again, because there's all those you're trying to hit the legendary animal and all that kind of stuff. You have to have it respawn. Yeah. Right. Like you're dealing with that.
Yeah, I did. I liked that discussion. I'm not a hunter currently, but I grew up out in the country, and my dad was a hunter, and so we went hunting several times. And I remember shooting animals, and then having to figure out what do you do with them, and they're heavy and they're massive. Often if you're shooting deer, or the few times I went when I was younger, we shot quail, which are tiny little birds, right? And I remember thinking that is a very different experience than how it's commonly represented in a game, where you shoot it, the animal turns into, a piece of meat from a 1920s cartoon, and you go click on it, and then nothing is there. Yeah. It's that is way easier than what you actually have to do if you're a hunter.
Yeah, jumping, getting that messy. Yeah. And seeing what you
painful
just did.
And difficult and, nausea-inducing and everything else.
Yeah, and I did I've never played RDR1, but there's an achievement.
I saw that.
That you can hunt the buffalo to extinction, and it throws in your face, right, that manifest destiny.
It calls it manifest destiny, yeah.
And so there's a shaming.
Yes.
Again, and I think this is sort of a part of the pleasure in the game is being confronted with acts that you have to do because the game makes you do them, but it pushes it in your face. Yeah. Right? We're forcing you to do these bad things. Yeah. By the way, this is how bad it is. Yeah. And by the way, we're going to throw manifest destiny in there as sort of a cheeky kind of
Now, of course, that one is optional. But if you're a completionist, you want to get all those achievements, you're going to do it, and then you're going to be confronted with that of okay, you got the achievement, but that's what you just did, or
whatever, which plays on that type of player.
Absolutely.
Because then there might be players, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. Right? I'm not going to be a completionist, or I can't do it, or whatever. Yeah.
And then the other part too, I think, is the traveling, and we spoke a bit about this earlier.
I thought that was a really good point in that essay. That I had obviously thought about that particular part of the game, but it's just not something that I was as centrally focused on. And I thought that the author did a really good job of just bringing that to the attention, and the fact that Audubon chapters were saying, hey, here's how you basically be a birder in Red Dead 2, that's wild to me. I would not have expected that either. So I thought that was really neat, even with the kind of ambivalence about how it treats environmental change or our role in environmental degradation or whatever. So the one that I chose to talk about today is the one about tuberculosis and Arthur's death being a good death. This is by the
Arno
German
Gorgon.
author. Yes, thank you. I thought, man, I'm gonna mess up how to pronounce that. Arno Gorgon. Yeah. So I thought this was really interesting for a couple of different reasons. I think that the way that we understand and think about the nature of health and disease has like changed over time. So I totally get the point that the author is going for about this idea of medicalization, where we take something and then we make it a medical issue, even if it doesn't start out that way or even if it isn't. Part of me thinks that's perfectly true, but also there are some cases where I think that I think that in principle there's probably some kind of like theoretical or value neutral concept of health and disease, but like for a range of things, like I think for example like cancer in humans, it seems hard to treat that as anything other than something really horrible and awful in terms of it disrupting the functioning of our body or the functioning of you as a person. Whereas something like attempts to medicalize homosexuality or attempts to medicalize certain kinds of mental illness seem more to be about do you neatly fit into society, or are you doing something moral versus some other kinds of diseases. So this is obviously a complicated matter, but I really enjoyed the discussion of tuberculosis and kind of how it's shifted right from this kind of like young aristocratic, good romantic death, versus now it's like something that is mostly happening with poor people and with black people, and so now it becomes more of a moral barometer of your immoral lifestyle led you to be this sick, right? Mm-hmm. And it's also that same immoral lifestyle or inability to be disciplined or lack of will is what led you to be poor too, or something, right? So I think about that. I teach a bioethics class, and one of the things we discuss are different ways to understand and think about disability. So we discuss medical models of disability, but also social models of disability. And so, I think there are really social elements to understanding disease and treating disease that I thought the author did a good job talking about in the context of tuberculosis. I think that, the bit, and this is a big spoiler, so if you were not at the end of the game and you read this, you got some extra information, but Arthur gets tuberculosis, right? And then that is there are different things you can do at the end to maybe cause his death to be differently, but that's really the thing that leads to his degradation, and to some extent maybe his attempt to reflect on his life and whether he's been moral, and kind of go to that, if you choose to play it that way, try to kind of make up, right, for the bad things that he did or whatever. The idea of death, I think, is really interesting as a philosophical matter. There was this, when I was in grad school, there was this course that, some, quote unquote, this is from what other members of my department would say, this quote unquote old hippie from the 70s made this class in philosophy called Human Destiny. And so, of course, now a lot of the very tough, empirically minded, rational philosophers are like, what even is that? That doesn't even mean anything or whatever. So one of the teachers that I liked, I ended up TAing for that class initially, and she taught it, and she said, well, what we're going to talk about is death, because that's the one thing we all have in common. So that's what we're going to do, is talk about death, because if we're all destined to do anything, ultimately it's going to be to die or confront death. And so, so I think death is something, I'm teaching a philosophy of death class in the fall. I think it's something that people don't always think about, or they don't think about it maybe enough. Certainly we see it depicted all the time in movies, in literature, and in video games. But it's also something I think we don't really think about and we don't like to deal with. People try to bring this up to their elderly relatives or their family members, like, this is what I want to happen if I die. And oftentimes the response is, well, let's worry about that another time. Let's not talk about it. It's bumming me out, whatever, right? Now, on the other hand, I think sometimes people find death, they kind of romanticize it, and they think about it as this thing to aim at. So, Dan, I don't know if you ever had like a goth phase when you were growing up or developing, but I had like a quasi-goth phase, and like that was totally where I was just like, oh yeah, I'm just going to be brooding and like, or whatever, right? And part of that was because there is this kind of romanticization or romantic view of death or something. And so I think you can kind of go in between those two things, right? I think it's, it is important to think about and talk about. It really is the thing that you will deal with if you haven't already. And it's the one thing it will ultimately happen to us. And so I think it's it deserves some attention and thought. And certainly, going back to the beginning of philosophy, Socrates talked about philosophy as being the best sort of preparation for death, and that being the business of philosophy. And you see this echoed in existentialists, right? I mean, Camus very famously says the only real philosophical question is, should I commit suicide? Right? That's the only thing. If your philosophy can't answer that, it's a waste of my time, right? And so there is this sense that, like, what am I living for? And what is the point of life? And one thing that I talk about in that death class, and that is I thought really relevant here, is, in the Gorgon essay, is just thinking about, thinking about death doesn't have to just be, very bleak and brooding in this kind of stereotypical way. Thinking about death, and in particular why it's bad when it's bad, forces you to think carefully about what you think is valuable about life, about living, right? And so contemplating and thinking about death, even if it's in the context of, is this a good death, right, for Arthur? Does it allow him to develop a kind of moral reflection or something like that? In a broader way of thinking about it, you can also just think that that's one thing that really coming to grips with and thinking about the nature of death and how we view it and understand it, why we grieve it, why we are worried about it in our own case, that can really help you understand, for an individual at least, what you take to be really important about life and valuable about life. And so I thought that was really interesting. The other thing I couldn't help but think about here is, I was a philosophy and English major, and so one of the things that I took a class on Edgar Allan Poe, and he very famously wrote The Masque of the Red Death, which is a short story about tuberculosis essentially, but also he's during this period of time when, I think it's in like the early 1800s or something like that, maybe mid 1800s. His mother dies of tuberculosis, and then his father dies. So like at 2 years old, some family just takes him in because there's like nobody else. And then his wife, who was his cousin, who he married when she was 13 and he was 27, also dies of tuberculosis, which seems to basically crater any good thing that he had going for him. And it's like wrecked his emotional stability. And so I just think about, the way that tuberculosis is often depicted in, literature. And even, one thing that the author noted that I think is really relevant, I think sometimes you can think about tuberculosis as this thing far away, but like it's still in the top 10 things that contribute to death worldwide. It is still a serious issue, especially in places that maybe don't have as much medical infrastructure or just economic resource. And even for people now, my uncle, before he passed away, he dealt with like a couple different bouts of tuberculosis. And I don't think it's because he was like an old-timey 19th century guy. It's because he was poor and had serious drug problems and a number of other things. And sometimes you're pretty ripe for getting infected with tuberculosis in those cases, right? So I just thought it was really interesting. I liked the discussion of the idea of a good death, especially in the context of this game where there's death all around you and you're dealing it out often. Mm-hmm. And the tuberculosis is like a natural thing. It's also really cool, I thought, how they wove it into the mechanics of the gameplay. So it's not just a purely narrative thing. It actually affects like how much of your total stamina you can regenerate. It affects your health by affecting your weight overall. Like, I thought that was really interesting. In addition to, like, it changes how you see Arthur. He becomes pale, the lips are bloody and torn, all of that kind of stuff. So I thought that was a really interesting essay.
Yeah, it definitely, what video game forces the player to go through.
That's right.
And again, it's another thing that just makes this such a strange experience. Like, I can't imagine any Grand Theft Auto game.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Where you would have, or I think of like the Fallout games. Like you might get a disease, but it runs its course and
then you can cure it
in game time 30 minutes.
That's right. Yeah.
Right, or you can take a disease. Like there's all these things to like. Oh, it's not a big deal.
Yeah. I think I'm trying to think of anything that's comparable. I think in one of I don't remember if it was Oblivion. Maybe it was Oblivion, the Elder Scrolls game, where sometimes just like as a random event, you would get attacked by a vampire. And once that happened, I don't know, this has been a long time since I played this, and so this could be vague or I could be wrong about this, but as I recall, like I don't think you can cure it. Oh, I think you're just a vampire then and it affects you. So like you basically have to go back to a prior save if you don't want that to happen. and it affects like how you can relate to other people, whether you can be out, it affects your life, it affects mechanics of the game. Whereas other kinds of diseases, you just drink a potion or go to the town doctor and you get healed or whatever.
Yeah,
so
it's just
this is a case where it doesn't. And even really thinking about it, the other thing it made me think about is just like the history of medicine and concept of disease. So, right, this is really, I think, and we should maybe ask Dr. Perez, since this is kind of one of her jams, right? But this is, I think, during the period where you don't even have like a germ theory of disease. So it's still like the humors and the miasma, bad air, good air theory, which is why the guy in Saint Denis tells Arthur, you need to go to a sanitarium, which is really just like this open place with dry air and lots of sunshine, because people thought that air quality had a lot to do with your illness. And if you just change the air quality, you're changing up the illness. So it's also just fascinating for that reason too. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of our weekly podcast on our course and on the game. As always, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions via email or phone, and we'll be back with you next week.
Amen.
Thanks.